Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture to both of you that are watching, anyone watching live, and also people watching the recording later. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Rowland Atkinson from the University of Sheffield, and we're going to be talking today about gentrification and fair cities. And this is going to be perfect, hopefully, for anyone studying A-level at the moment. There is a chat box on the side, so if you have any questions throughout the lecture, please do just leave them there, and we'll ask Rowland those ones at the end. But for the moment, I'll hand over to Rowland.
That's great. Thanks, Harriet, and welcome to you all today, and anyone who's watching this as a broadcast in the repository later on. So what I want to do today is talk about I guess the state of our cities today. You'll all be aware, I think, of in questions of increasing inequality. You may be seeing films of people in swimming pools between skyscrapers in cities like London, hearing about evictions in cities in Africa, or the issue of gentrification more broadly, the kind of social and physical upgrading of neighborhoods in cities really all over the world. And this is an area that I've been interested in since my PhD, which is about 25 years ago. And I was particularly interested in the displacement of people losing their homes as a result of gentrification, losing them because they were evicted by landlords, losing them because they could no longer afford to live in the area or to access a decent home in the city. And so all of those themes, none of those themes have gone away. This is all still incredibly relevant. And periodically people will say, oh, such a huge emphasis on gentrification. We need to sort of talk about something else. My argument would be, this is absolutely at the cutting edge of questions of social justice, of inequality and fairness, and the kind of spatial distribution of those issues in cities. So what I want to do today is kind of three things. So I'm going to go pretty kind of quickly. I want to try and cover everything in about 40 minutes, so there's some time for discussion at the end if you want to ask me some questions. The first thing I'm going to do is go into kind of definition. So that's the boring side of it, but it is kind of important in terms of what do we really mean by gentrification? And on the back of that, where do we see those processes? And then the second thing I want to do is think about what kind of effects gentrification has on cities and neighborhoods, and particularly, of course, on poorer and middle income households in cities around the world. And then finally, I'm just going to very briefly discuss kind of new and emerging patterns in relation to finance, super rich, how cities are sort of really, the trajectory of a lot of these processes is almost kind of going off the scale, really, and to try and integrate your interests into some of the things that I'm beginning to see in cities around us, and what do we do about some of this stuff. The whole point of the social sciences, of being a geographer, being a sociologist, being an urbanist, in my case, is not just to describe these issues, but to find ways of challenging and redirecting them so that questions of social justice can be really tackled. So let's see how far we can get. And I'm going to start off then with a quote that you may have seen, but it's from a geographer called Ruth Glass, who was doing a lot of work in the London of the 1960s. So this image is of Islington in the 1960s, an area that is now strongly associated, not really with gentrification, but with a kind of gentrification on steroids, what Loretta Lees would describe as super gentrification or financification. But Ruth Glass said that, in her observations about how the city was changing at that time, she said, one by one, many of the working class quarters have been invaded by the middle class, upper and lower. Once this process of, note the scare quotes, this process of gentrification starts in a district, it goes on rapidly until all or most of the working class occupiers are displaced, and the whole social character of the district is changed. So what she was saying is that, not a city that was stable in its social geography, but one in which new groups were moving into areas that were traditionally associated with being working class. Now, a number of neighbourhoods that we can think of, or a number of areas in a city like London, have changed quite dramatically over the last half century. Today, we're talking about areas like Brixton being extensively gentrified, when historically, or at least for the last half century, that was a more deprived part of the city. So was Notting Hill, an area that was actually built very much for the upper middle classes in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. That area is now really has real estate valued at really, the top 5% globally. So we've seen massive changes in a lot of areas where the middle classes have, in a sense, retaken or taken on those spaces that were associated with working class households. Now, to talk about working class, middle class, of course, is a very British way of framing these things. And I'm going to come back in a moment to talk about how we might define these things in a way that allows us to get some purchase on these issues in a global context. Now, when we come to the question of defining the process of gentrification, some analysts have suggested this is a very complicated process. It's one that is fraught with all kinds of conceptual difficulty. How do we measure it? How do we understand it? At the core of this is a process in which a neighbourhood, so the scale is important, a neighbourhood changes, and which the houses, the accommodation, and to some extent it might be also the commercial aspects of a neighbourhood, the local shopping district, for example. Those areas change, they're renovated, new people with more money moving into the neighbourhood. And that process is also often associated, and this is why the process is so controversial, it's often associated with the displacement, so the involuntary removal or replacement, people moving away and others replacing them, of working class by middle class households, or indeed low income residents by middle or high income residents. Another key sort of ingredient to this process is the capital reinvestment in housing. In other words, areas of housing that may be deteriorated because landlords have not looked after them properly, or areas in which poorer households live and are less able to maintain their homes. Money begins to flow into those spaces. So the Marxist urban geographer Neil Smith would say gentrification is fundamentally a movement back into often the central city by capital, as much as it is of households and individuals. It's people putting money back into the physical fabric of the city, partly because they want to live there, but partly also motivated by the sense that they can make money by doing so. That if one gentrifies the neighborhood, that begins to raise property values more broadly. So there's a kind of financial logic to this process, just as much as there is a social one. And so because of the question of displacement, which in some cases has been particularly extensive, the image that you have here is of Mitte in Berlin. The issue of gentrification has become an enormously contentious one. There are various cities, for example, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York, if we were talking about the American examples, where gentrification has become a kind of, I was going to say an insult, not an insult, but a highly problematic and contested process, because it means that poorer people are being kicked out of their homes. Now, Eric Clark this quote is now 16 years old, but it's a very useful one, because a lot of the work that Eric Clark did, a geographer based in Sweden, was to think about, what is specific to this process? How do we know that what we are seeing is in fact gentrification? And so he did a lot of kind of digging around through different definitions and thinking about what's it like in Sweden, what's it like in New York, how does this compare with Latin America and so on. He said that basically what it boils down to is, and I'm reading from here, quoting, gentrification is a process involving a change in the population of land users such that the new users are of a higher socio-economic status than the previous users, together with an associated change in the built environment through a reinvestment in fixed capital. So in other words, it's higher income people moving into a particular space. It might be a neighborhood, it might be a borough, or indeed a city. Some people have talked about London as a city that has been gentrified. So extensive are the changes. And then there's something about the physical changes that one sees, an upgrading of the built environment. And that's really, those aspects are at the core of this process. And so he says that the greater the difference between the people who already live there and the people who are moving in, the more noticeable it is. So I think a good example here would be some of the changes that we've seen in a city like San Francisco, where the new finance and tech economy of Silicon Valley has really created this quite expansive group of very highly paid individuals, households, who translate that money into the ability to move into, to buy up very attractive homes, in fact, in the central city, and thereby kind of changing that. But also, as I said a moment ago, generating a very intense kind of community politics, symbolized, for example, in the buses that are taking Silicon Valley workers to places of work at Google headquarters and all the rest of it, being kind of singled out as, a problem in that city. So I just actually was today trying to think about, how do we define gentrification? What is at the core of the definition? And I'll promise I'll move on beyond the definitions in a moment. What's core and what's at the periphery of this process? The first, in the center, in the core of that definition, is the new higher class or higher income residents moving into a particular neighborhood, and that sense of capital reinvestment. They are bringing money which may be expressed in the physical rehabilitation of the property, but not necessarily. So in other words, I think even if we just had those two characteristics in the middle, we would know that we were looking at the gentrification of X neighborhood. If you think about the city or town that you live in, can you see those kind of processes in evidence? Are you aware of that kind of thing going on? And then the rest of these other various ingredients are important, and some would argue that they are key, but they are not necessarily always found in the specific examples that we might be looking at in a particular city or a particular neighborhood. So that includes the physical upgrading, the displacement, because as I said before, it may be a process over time of replacement, or a combination of those processes. So if you take a neighborhood, going back to our example of Islington, it's not simply the case that all private rented tenants in those areas were evicted. Certainly some of them were harassed, and some of them were evicted out of their homes for sure. But also there's a process by which people, older residents die. They may be homeowners or private tenants. And over time, there is a slower process of replacement. But certainly there are other examples which are much more dramatic. And this is something that I'm going to pick up on in a moment, where we are seeing in countries, for example, cities in countries in Africa, in Latin America, Turkey, Istanbul would be another example, where the state, the city or the nation state is involved in promoting gentrification as a strategy to bring in capital, to bring investment either into the city or into the country more broadly. So I'm not going to go through the other sort of ingredients, but these are other things that I think are important, but slightly peripheral to the core of this process. So, you know, whether developers are involved, some people would say, some analysts would say that's really important, but it's not an absolutely necessary element of the definition. Here are two images, one from the present day Notting Hill, and one from the 1970s. So it gives you some sense of the kind of physical and social transformations that have gone on in some of the key areas, the key parts of British cities that have been associated with gentrification. And you could find other examples, for example, let's say Bristol, Edinburgh. You can see similar processes in evidence in a city like Glasgow, where very attractive property, which was quite often left by the middle classes, particularly from the late 19th century onwards, because these were very large single family homes, which became much more expensive to maintain. So many of those people sold those homes, and they were quite often subdivided and transferred into housing opportunities for migrant workers, for poorer households. This particular example, Notting Hill, was infamous as the place where the slum landlord, Peter Rackman, operated. And so this is also an example of, if you like, the kind of constant movement of poor households around the city, taking advantage of lower cost accommodation, and the geography of those opportunities shifting over time as the sort of rhythms, the movement of capital also circulates in the city. So the other thing that's happening in the backdrop of our story of gentrification from the 1960s is the growth of finance. It's the availability, the more widespread availability of mortgage finance. In the most recent kind of examples, it would be people buying properties like this and converting them into usage as Airbnbs, for example. So there's a big debate at the moment amongst analysts saying, can we consider the process of what is rather clumsily termed Airbnbification? Is that gentrification? You know, it doesn't involve a resident population, but there's a kind of capital reinvestment in the property. Would that satisfy the criteria for being defined as gentrification? So another thing, and I'm drawing quite extensively on London as a case study example, but many of the issues that I'm talking about, I want you to remember that we could be talking about New York, we could be talking about San Francisco and many other cities, Tokyo, where you have seen the quite considerable expansion of the financial services sector. If you go back to around the time that Ruth Glass coined the definition of gentrification, London's population was very high. It was at 8 million in 1961. And it was also a city that was changing. It was losing population quite considerably. So none of you will be sort of old enough to remember this, but when I was growing up, the idea of the inner city was used as a kind of spatial synonym, or as a kind of stand-in for the idea of poverty. British inner cities were seen to be places, particularly in 1981, you had the Brixton, Bristol and other riots, a bit like the 2011 riots. And the city was experiencing changing fortunes. It was seeing a steady exodus of population. And it isn't until the mid to late 1980s that the financial explosion begins to kind of really kick off and change the dynamics of the economy, a kind of professionalization of the economy. And so geographers like Chris Hamnett, for example, have argued that a lot of the gentrification that a city like London saw, particularly from the 70s and 80s onwards, was a reflection of a shift in the occupational structure of the city, because the expansion of finance, particularly the expansion of banking, the insurance sectors and so on, in tandem with changes in the global economy, created a new class of individual households who translated their newfound wealth, or at least their higher incomes, into searches for property in the central city. Where can I live that is nice and close to my new job in the City of London? Well, somewhere like Islington, I can cycle to work, I could theoretically walk to work, or get a very short tube stop. When I was doing interviews in London in the 1990s, estate agents were telling me that people working in the City of London with, let's say, a bonus of something approaching £1 million would say, well, that's very nice because that translates into a nice house in Notting Hill. I can get on the Central Line and be into work very, very rapidly. So there's all sorts of questions here about what was happening in terms of the changing taste of individuals, of new kind of social class fractions. So a geographer like David Ley from Canada talks about the emergence of a kind of new middle class, a class that was much more, shall we say, predisposed and interested in living in with the excitement of the central city, which was at that point historically associated with poverty, various kind of social problems in the central cities of the global north, and it was keen to explore the opportunities of living in those kind of spaces. It was excited by that. And now, I guess, growing up, let's say, over the last 1 or 2 decades, you would look at, let's say, the British and European central city as a place that was relatively fashionable, as a place that has seen massive capital reinvestment, that this is, the place to be, who wants to live in the suburbs, and so on. All of those kind of geographical assumptions right at this very moment, of course, have been upended by COVID. And of course, many of you will be familiar with the kind of stories in the press about how people are moving to green and blue locations. They're moving to seaside locations. They're moving to areas where people can get a garden, larger houses, and so on. So that's the kind of shifting social geography at the moment. I guess a lot of people are trying to figure out whether that's a good bet, or whether those trends will continue, or whether people will gravitate back to the cities as the places of, the primary space in social terms, cultural terms, political, but also economic. In other words, that will people be drawn back to office and other places of work in the city in ways that stop them suburbanizing in quite those sort of ways? This is just a quick graphic from some work by Chris Hamnett, which shows the changing expansion in the sort of elite occupations between 1961 and the late 1990s. And it just gives you an indication of how significant the growth in finance, business, and related services was over that period. And so, as I said, Chris Hamnett is sort of has written various kinds of research articles talking about how the city has changed, particularly in tandem with these changes in the occupational structure of the city. So some of this is about geography, but we also need to be aware of the kind of sociology, if you like, of these processes as well. So if you look at what theories were saying about, the nature of the city, I remember Neil Smith observing that, gentrification was seen as a kind of surprising trend. All of the kind of, or many of the geographical theories about how the city was socially organized and distributed pointed to very long-term trends in suburbanization, the movement out of the city by those people who have the opportunities to do so, who have the money to do so, the expansion of the suburbs, people moving beyond the suburbs into attractive rural locations, and so on. And so gentrification was a kind of reversal of that disinvestment by the middle and upper middle classes. It was led by this sort of vanguard new class of what some people talk about as the symbolic analysts, the new kind of service occupations, working in insurance, working in, of course, in state-related services of various kinds, people who are teachers, people, university professors, and so on, who wanted this slice of urban life that many of their parents had moved away from, in the post-war period. And then the other thing that's very important here is, particularly if you look at the early geography of gentrification, if I think about the early 1990s doing field work in London, I quite often had to explain to people that I was doing work on gentrification, and gentrification means this, because they didn't really understand that term, because it was not widely used. And of course, nowadays, you could be in Mexico, you could be in South Africa and talk about gentrification, and people will know what you're talking about. So the point is that this geography particularly begins and ramps up in locations like London, New York, cities like Tokyo, and other large cities with significant financial service sectors who produce, if you like, a class of gentrifiers, produce those people who are looking to move into these kinds of locations. Now, this is a kind of complicated slide, and I'll leave you to sort of look at this in your own time. But the broad sweep of gentrification history is captured by a number of academic researchers who have talked about these different waves of gentrification. So essentially moving from a kind of fairly sporadic individual at the household level process, individuals making choices to live in, let's say, downtown Manhattan in the 1970s. They might have thought that this was attractive. It's kind of cool to live in the loft apartments of Soho, capital S, capital H, because it's south of Houston. It's not Soho like the Soho of London. The point, Soho actually, as a digression, Soho is quite interesting because this was a designation. It was an artificial creation by local real estate agents who wanted to market real estate in an area which at that time was pretty degraded. There was quite significant amounts of public housing in the area, and it was seen as, fairly down at heel, really. The loft apartments were spaces where the lofts were where the fabric was held in the garment district. And but this is also a space that had been made trendy by Patti Smith, by the kind of punk movement, people moving into these loft style apartments, which began to sort of kick off this process. Artists breaking ground for capital, making it cool in ways that brought in further investment. Then you see this from the 1980s onwards, a kind of second wave movement as the process begins to take in other cities outside the kind of London, New York, San Franciscos of this world. An intensifying struggle over displacement, particularly in the US. Eric Clark makes the observation that, why is it that gentrification sees, literally street battles in Berlin and similar in cities like New York and San Francisco, whereas in a city like Malmo in Sweden, or indeed in London, there's been a much more muted reaction to these kind of processes. And one of the reasons, and there's several reasons for this, but of course in countries like the UK, like Sweden, where there is some form of both welfare provision and public housing, in other words, assistance for people who are in the kind of poorest positions, that we need to sort of bracket off the complexity of the fact that austerity over the last decade has led to massive cuts in public housing investment, massive cuts in welfare spending. But nevertheless, historically, what that tended to do was it meant that people at least could find another home if they were displaced from a particular neighborhood. Now, if you lived in the New York of the 1970s or 80s and you were displaced, the consequences of that process are so much more profound. Very scant provision of either welfare or public housing to support people on low incomes in those cities. So the broader theme that I'm beginning to sort of push towards here is the sense that this is a process that is intimately bound up with broader questions of inequality in income, inequality in wealth, and also inequalities that are focused around the real estate system that bring in investors with very large amounts of money looking to make a profit, capital, money in motion, looking for places to invest to make more money. So the third wave sees an expansion of that kind of process. Fourth and fifth waves. This is where Loretta Lees and colleagues would argue in the fourth wave, we increasingly see the state involved in this process. And again, London becomes a very good example, but we could be talking about Mexico City, we could be talking about Istanbul, certain cities in Spain, so Barcelona might be an example, particularly Paris, where the state takes a kind of coordinating role. It becomes interested in working with the kind of real estate system in ways that bring more investment in the city. The city becomes interested in promoting the city as a potential space of gentrification, and in ways that I'm going to show you particularly emphatically in a moment. Fifth wave is a process that you might want to kind of look up in your own time, because it's not a concept that's easy to necessarily grasp, but it is that of financialization. It is the expansion of the financial services sector, the expansion of financial instruments of various kinds, the increasing dominance of the financial services sector more generally in political life, and what that has done to the city, particularly as it has produced more sort of super rich winners at a global level, and what kind of imprint are they having on the city. Loretta Lees would say they are more and more related to this process of financification. So in other words, it's not, let's say public sector professionals like teachers and social workers living in the Islington of the 1970s. It's a lawyer for one of the big firms earning, £200,000-300,000 a year in the City of London, for example. The character of the process, the characters involved in it, the money sort of circulating in that space becomes intensified. I just started beginning to put together a list then of some of the new forms of this process, because you've got various commentators now who are saying that gentrification takes on new forms. So I've already mentioned the process of, from gentrification to super gentrification to financification, the discussion about whether Airbnbification is part of this process. I'm kind of slightly ambivalent on that. I think it's a related process, but it's dealing in quite often a non-resident population. You've got an increasing level of mobility within a particular neighborhood that does not really reflect the kind of intention behind gentrification as a term. Some people talk about greentrification, again, sort of slightly kind of clumsy terminology perhaps. Greentrification is about the relationship between green space and sort of eco-conscious middle and high income groups moving into the city. We have new build gentrification. So particularly we've seen along the waterfront in cities like New York, in cities like London, not just people moving into and colonizing existing neighborhoods, but the demolition or creation of new property and the colonization of that by higher income groups. And then finally, what I mentioned a moment ago, the increasing role of the state. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of move on to the planetary mode, because this is critical. And so this is signaling a kind of shift in the way that we begin to think about gentrification, that this is not a process that is just about, I've talked a lot about London, I appreciate, but this is not just a process that affects cities like London. It begins to cascade down the hierarchy of other cities within certainly countries in the global north, but it also begins to affect many cities around the world. And this, I think, particularly from 80s, but particularly from the 90s onwards, more and more people, urbanists, urban geographers, saying, kind of stop talking about London, because this is affecting us here in Rio de Janeiro. It's affecting us in Dubai, in Istanbul. It's affecting parts of Singapore, Chinese cities increasingly. And so there's a sense that the language, the geography of where we're talking about when we think about gentrification, we need to expand our kind of consciousness and not simply assume that we're talking about the biggest cities with the biggest financial services sectors. It's affecting more cities outside of that kind of traditional sort of geography. Nevertheless, a lot of the cities that we will tend to look at, and so we've got Osaka, Porto, Istanbul in these tiny little images here. A lot of those cities have in fact begun to be exposed to the financial services, to the increasing role of finance as the expansion in the global financial economy begins to look for new places to invest. The individual investors look for new places to invest. London is kind of saturated. Paris is saturated. There's no money to be made there, in a sense, some real estate agents would say. There's no cheap property to be found. So in the British case, I've been doing some work in Liverpool, for example, where the returns to investors investing in private rental accommodation are way higher in a city like Liverpool compared with London. And that kind of logic, what Neil Smith would describe as a kind of rent gap, looking for places that have been disinvested in, drives the flows of capital, that drives the flows of reinvestment into space where there is money to be made. It's also important to understand that the new middle class, these class fragments working in finance, working in public service professions and so on, there's also been an expansion in those groups in many countries around the world, an expansion in people with the money to act as sort of mini property investors in their own right through their residential choices, or indeed looking for, in some cases, second properties to invest in. Something that I've already mentioned is how city authorities are also part of the story here. So the coordinated efforts of a city like Rio de Janeiro kind of springs to mind as somewhere that you would really sort of look at as the city really trying to promote a process of gentrification, partly actually as a process, as we saw in New York in the 1980s, a process to actually spearhead the removal of poorer residents from the city. We don't want ghettos and barrios. We want to beautify the city. We want to get rid of those places because they're also associated with criminality and so on. In fact, a lot of that criminality is also connected to higher income groups in the city who purchase the drugs supplied by the gangs living in those areas. But nevertheless, what you have seen there is the sense that it's what the geographer Neil Smith would refer to as a kind of revanchist logic, a revenge on the urban poor. We're going to take back the city. We're going to take it back in the name of respectable society, and we're going to make it a beautiful place. And if that means that poorer households get displaced in the process, then it's not a problem. Okay, so displacement is something that really has interested me in my own research over the in the past, and that process often takes place through a number of routes. How is it that people lose their home? The primary mechanism is because where people are renting their homes and they have few rights enshrined in national law, it makes them vulnerable to a process of gentrification, because then the landlord can say, look, I can double the rent. I can get somebody else in who works in, they've got a higher paying job than you have. I can rent it to them as the neighborhood becomes more attractive. I'm going to put up the rent. If you can't pay it, then you need to move out. And some of that process would be about a standard process of eviction. So in the UK, after you've served your initial 6-month term, you can very easily be evicted by a landlord. In the US and Australia, it's also similarly very easy to get rid of a tenant that you no longer want. So this process of displacement is really what exercises people perhaps the most, the sense of a loss of place. People literally being traumatized by being kicked out of the neighborhoods that they have lived in, and particularly in a number of cities, New York and London notably, but many others around the world, the destruction of public housing and the movement of lower income tenants out of the city as part of this kind of coordinated gentrification strategy. So a really good example of that, and I encourage you to sort of get involved in this, in some of this stuff, and to look at it in more detail. This is the Haygate estate in London, much of which has now been demolished. You can see that from the graphic, the kind of people that they are hoping will move into the area. 1,200 homes demolished. I think about 3,000 or more households. 3,000 or so individuals displaced from this location. More homes put in, but the key point here is the tenure. The geography of the tenure of these homes is shifted dramatically. So there has been a net loss of not just affordable accommodation, but accommodation which is reserved for those people on low incomes, people working in precarious labor, of which there are more and more, and people who require a subsidized rent, an affordable rent, and a secure place to be, because, of course, we know that the conditions in the private rented sector are particularly problematic for reasons that I've just kind of gone into. So these changes have been really quite spectacular. So I apologize for the low resolution of this. It was the best that I could find. But this is just a mapping of where people have been moved to. So this is not people being displaced from the Islingtons and the Notting Hills of this world, or indeed the Brixtons of this world over the last 10, 20, 30 years or so. This is simply a very rapid process of displacement as the state has designated an area of public housing as a kind of opportunity space. It has sought to unlock capital investment from private developers to move low income and low and no income tenants, and indeed some on moderate incomes, moving them wherever necessary in order to secure that space in the interests of capital. Now, I need to sort of move on here, but this, thousands of households have been moved from those neighbourhoods, and this is a process that's continuing to move forward in ways that move us from stage 1, stage 2 gentrification, where we had that kind of more sporadic process, into a kind of state coordinated assault really on the provision of affordable housing in a city which of course is extremely stressed in terms of its resident base. Now I'm just going to say a few remarks about where we seem to be going with some of this stuff. We seem to have moved into a process or a state in which it's, some of this is about gentrification for sure. Some of it is about financification, but some of this is also about the relationship between the richest of the city, a group who have increased in dramatic numbers over the last decade, many of whom have bought property in cities like London to invest in, but in fact rarely spend a great deal of time there. So this image that you can see here is the development One Hyde Park, built really to absorb surplus capital. It isn't really there to accommodate bodies, very wealthy bodies at that, but it's really there as a space of investment. So this has raised more and more questions about the role of housing, the financialization of housing. This is housing as an asset, a place to invest in rather than to live in. And so if you set aside some of those, the growth of that group against some of these indicators here that I've listed, which is a kind of catalogue of poverty, social distress, and essentially trauma if we're looking at the displacement of people from, the Haygate and many other of the around 80 estates that have been destroyed in the city over the last decade. There are real questions to be asked about how we move towards a fairer urban system. And that fairness, I could be talking about many, many cities around the world where this process of financialization, this process of gentrification begin to kind of come together to produce cities that are much more hostile to those people on low and moderate incomes. Many of the people, the students that I teach on my courses who are interested in the question of social justice, the question of how we create fairer cities, themselves are likely to leave degree programs quite often into well-paid jobs, but in which they are competing really with private capital to find a place in that city. They're finding a space that is hostile to their needs to find a home in the city. And many of those people are, in a sense, set against the availability of housing because there isn't sufficient controls on a lot of these processes, that you're competing with investors and investment capital. So private equity is currently investing billions of pounds into London real estate, trying to bet on the possibility that this is going to be worth more in the future. So this is a long way from the scenario that I sketched in the 1970s Islington context, where people were buying to find a home, and they're I don't know, a social worker, let's say, and a teacher trying to find a space in the center of the city. This process is one kind of on steroids, essentially. Now, I'm going to finish in about 1 minute, and this was just some thoughts on where we might go with some of this stuff. I think as geographers, many geographers have a kind of commitment, as I said when I started off, to not just describe these processes, but to get involved. And how can we find ways to protect people who are on low and moderate incomes in many cities around the world? One of the most important, I think that I'm just going to focus on the first two here, really. The first one is that many geographers now are making quite critical commentaries about the need to protect and invest in public housing, that there's no reason why you need to see poor quality public housing. And in fact, much of the bad reputation of public housing is as a result of declining investment and declining sort of maintenance over the years. In other words, not sufficient expenditure and management of public housing. And there are various examples that I could show you of award-winning public housing. There's one recent development in Norwich, for example, wonderful stuff. And of course, the point is it's both affordable, it's secure, and it gives people the opportunity to access the city, to access other aspects of their social lives, which are so critical. Second key area, and this is really sort of heating up in cities like Berlin, in Barcelona, in Paris, in London, and in many cities in Spain and Latin America, is how do we begin to ensure that people who are paying money to a landlord are not being exploited, that we find methods of controlling rent, and also controlling their rights in terms of the ability to live there without fear of very rapid eviction. I will leave you to sort of look over some of those other ideas. If you also go onto my website, you will find a free download of a recent book that I've written, which sets out several other kind of suggestions. So I'm going to finish, in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up then just by quickly reviewing what we've covered today. I apologize for sort of speeding up towards the end there. I'm happy to field any questions that you may have. But we talked about how gentrification is, what characterizes that process, but increasingly the sense that this is a process that is a signal or a symbol, if you like, of urban change around the world today, that we're seeing that in cities all over the place. And the questions of what that represents in terms of debates about inequality, injustice, eviction, displacement, and so on, are really at the forefront of that debate. A lot of what we're looking at here is resulting from patterns of inequality in wealth and income and international flows of capital. I encourage you to read the finance pages, the property pages, and look at the way that some of these issues are talked about if you're interested in getting more involved in and sort of arming yourself with knowledge about what gentrification is really about. The Sunday supplements that talk about, invest in this neighborhood. This is an up and coming neighborhood. How is that sort of a motor, a driver of this process of gentrification? And then finally, that there are these new and emerging forms of these combinations of state action, of capital and finance investment that are coming together in ways that are increasingly antagonistic to, increasingly aggressive towards people on low but also moderate incomes. And so this may be you as you, I don't know, finish your A levels and get a job, finish a degree and get a job. Where are you going to live in the city, and how will you be accommodated? And to what extent are processes like this hostile or problematic towards your own future in the city? Okay, I shall leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rowland. That was great. I hope everyone enjoyed that. I know today, obviously, we've drawn on a lot of examples of places like London and big cities, but it's a process that you can see particularly everywhere in the country. Something like Airbnb affects a lot of rural locations as well. If you are interested in sort of taking this a bit further and using it for your independent investigation, I would recommend a workshop that we did, which is also on the GEO website, called Refining Focus, a new look at regeneration in independent investigations. That was run by our friends at the Field Studies Council. So if you're looking into how you can use this for your independent investigation, that would be a great place to start. We do have a question, and if you've got any more questions, please do leave them in the comments. Naomi Anderson, who's a teacher, is asking, her students often ask about the unfairness and displacement and how it can be managed for the benefit of all, because the place is nicer afterwards, right? Do we have a sense of that top-down initiatives work?
It's a good question, Naomi. I think it's fair to say, if I try and capture the breadth of views amongst people who are gentrification researchers, I would say there are people certainly who feel that, in a sense, this is if I can be a bit poetic, it's a beast that can be tamed. In other words, that we want gentrification, we want the improvement of the physical fabric of many neighborhoods, we want to see investment. I think there are also many others who are very either critical or anxious that by feeling that we can do something actually in that kind of space, quite often what we tend to do is actually submit ourselves to the logic of capital investment. In other words, that capital, money in motion, money looking to make more money, is a very, very powerful force, and it will always, in a sense, do its thing. It will not, it's very hard to sort of restrain that kind of process. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that the state increasingly has, or it depends on, the Marxist geographers will say, this is the state doing what it's kind of programmed to do. It is, David Harvey would say, the state is the adjunct of capital. It's doing the things to sort of facilitate these processes because that's what it's there for. It's designed to kind of smooth the way for capital investment, capital expansion. This is, the capitalist system is not just about factories and, workers and owners. It's also about that circuit investment that operates primarily through the city, through property, through land investment, and so on. If you're asking me personally, I think it's quite hard to find sort of positive examples, I guess. What I would say in response actually is it's actually quite important to be aspatial in the way that we respond to gentrification. In other words, there's not much that we can do in relation to a specific area. You cannot really very easily put the brakes on this kind of process once it gets going. What you can do is find forms of taxation, other sort of macro kind of settings, which reduce the levels of inequality. So I mentioned it, I didn't mention it, but the wealth tax, which is a big thing at the moment in relation to the super rich, but questions of taxation, a land tax, all of these are new or relatively new and exciting ways of diminishing the inequalities such that the driver for gentrification in the first place is itself squeezed out of the system. So of course all of this depends on our personal politics. If you're asking me, I think we need a land tax, we need a wealth tax. The debate is not about doctors and school head teachers, let's say, and people who clean up street refuse. It's about ordinary people and big capital, big money, and rich people. There's plenty of money out there to secure the investment. There's much less interest in paying for those things. So I think we need more investment in public housing and other mechanisms, because the beauty of public housing is it's sort of locked into the system, and that's actually why it's being dismantled in various locations. I think politically it's seen to be we don't want these people living here, essentially. We could talk for a long time on those kind of issues.
Well, it sounds like that's answered Naomi's question. She says she's got so many more ideas for framing and discussing gentrification examples now, so that's great to hear. I don't think we have any more questions at the moment, but if you're watching this later and you do have a question, feel free to leave it in the comments below and we can pass that on to Rowland for you. But thank you to everyone for watching today. We hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'll wrap it up there. Have a nice evening, everyone.